In this lesson, we're going to look at the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle helps us to understand how the element carbon moves around in our atmosphere. It can be found in different molecules. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be found in sugars that we eat. It can be found in starches that we eat as well. It can be found in other structural molecules that make up our bodies and make up the wood of plants and other things that we find around us. There's also carbon in minerals and rocks that we find around us as well. And fossil fuels are big sources of carbon that originally came from living things, but now are existing as kind of a compressed, condensed, really high energy fuel, which makes them very useful for burning. So the carbon cycle helps us to understand how carbon can move between these different forms and how it could be transferred from one form to another. So in the carbon cycle, we're going to start out by looking at, just in general, how can we find carbon? So we can find carbon as CO2, atmospheric CO2 in the atmosphere. There's about 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there's not a huge amount, a lot less than the oxygen that we breathe. But that carbon that's present as the carbon dioxide is going to be very important. We'll also find carbon in the bodies of plants. So plants are producing carbohydrates like glucose, C6H12O6, so that's glucose. Those glucose molecules are useful for the plants. They produce them as an energy supply. But then those plants can also be eaten by animals, and the carbon can move into the bodies of animals. And as animals breathe out carbon dioxide, it can then travel back into the atmosphere. So that's one of the ways that carbon dioxide can move. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So the first thing that we'll look at is, how does the carbon dioxide get from the atmosphere into the bodies of plants? So this process here is photosynthesis, and it's the moving of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere down into plant bodies. So it's this first arrow here. And you've learned about photosynthesis before. You can see that there's carbon in the carbon dioxide reactant here, and there's also carbon in the glucose product. And so this is showing how we're taking carbon dioxide gas and we're moving it to aqueous, or dissolved in water, sugar, or glucose. And then the plant can convert this glucose into other types of sugars like sucrose for storage, or into starches to be used to build its bodies and that kind of thing. But photosynthesis shows us how the carbon dioxide can move from the gas up here, from the atmosphere, down into plant bodies. And that's really important because you can see, coming from the atmospheric CO2 here, there's only one way that carbon gets out of the atmosphere and into other forms in bodies, and that is through photosynthesis. It's either being done by plants on land or by marine plants like algae, which are kind of like little tiny one-celled plants. They aren't technically plants, but they're kind of like that. So you'll need to know about photosynthesis. So this is our formula. We have 6 carbon dioxides that react with 6 waters to produce 1 glucose molecule, which is a C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen molecules here. The oxygen molecules are going to go back into the atmosphere, and that we could study in the oxygen cycle if we had time. But one thing that we should point out here is that sometimes a misconception about plants is that when they're producing oxygen, they're doing it for us. Like, what are plants? Oh, plants are great. They make oxygen for us. And they do make oxygen for us, but that's not what they're trying to do. The oxygen for the plant is a waste product. They don't want that oxygen. That's a waste. They're trying to make is this glucose, because that can be used for energy. And it can also be used for structural things, for building up the body of the plant. Okay, so that's how the carbon can get into the plants. Now, once it's in the bodies of the plants, then we can see it can move into animals here. It can get eaten by primary consumers who are going to want to eat plants. And then higher level consumers, which would be secondary. If you're eating a primary consumer, you're a secondary consumer. Or if you're eating a secondary consumer, then you're a tertiary consumer. And the carbon can move into these bodies here. So they're still present in things like glucose. The plant, the rabbit here is eating the nice tender shoots of grasses and things like that. It's not eating this tree, but it's eating nice tender shoots, and that's what's allowing it to steal the glucose from the plants. And then the higher level consumers can eat the primary consumers and take the glucose from them. Then what do? Well, now they have the glucose and they want to use it. So in our bodies, in the bodies of animals, we want to make a molecule called ATP. ATP is a high energy molecule, and it's used by all sorts of various parts of your cells to accomplish different things. So it's used in order to produce muscle contractions. It's used in order to help your neurons to fire, to send messages around your body, all kinds of things in your body. So this is what we want. This is our desired product. We want the ATP, but in the process, we are going to use some oxygen, and we're going to make carbon dioxide and water. And the carbon dioxide then is going to go back up into the atmosphere, right? You see this label cellular respiration right here. So as cellular respiration happens, that can allow the carbon dioxide to get back up into the atmosphere from higher level consumers, from primary consumers. It's not shown on this graph, but even plants are doing cellular respiration too, and they're taking some of the sugars that they make and they're turning back into atmospheric CO2. So you'll notice that on the grand scheme of things, right, at the large scale, cellular respiration and photosynthesis are basically the opposite of each other. Here's photosynthesis down here. Here's cellular respiration up here. So the photosynthesis has got carbon dioxide and water as reactants. In the cellular respiration, the carbon dioxide and water are products. And in photosynthesis, we made glucose and oxygen. Well, those are the things that go into cellular respiration. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are basically the opposite of each other, at least when we look at them on the big scale like this. And these things are happening relatively quickly. So we have plants that are using carbon dioxide, they're producing sugars, animals are eating them, it's turning back into atmospheric CO2. And so what we end up having happen here is we have this loop of CO2 that gets cycled through these things relatively quickly. And because it gets cycled relatively quickly, we call it the rapid cycle, because it happens quite quickly. The carbon dioxide gets used, it gets produced again, it gets used, it gets produced again. But what happens if it doesn't get used up again right away? What if we produce these sugars and maybe this tree, instead of getting eaten, the tree kind of falls over and it gets buried? Well, if it's died and it's not eaten by something, decomposers can start to break it down. And when decomposers break down dead materials, they produce CO2 again. But sometimes, if my plant material gets trapped in just the right conditions and it gets trapped underground where it can't decompose, then it can enter this slow cycle. And it can enter the slow cycle, and it can either turn into rocks and minerals. And if it turns into rocks and minerals, then that carbon it's kind of trapped there. And there aren't very many ways that carbon can get released back into the atmosphere. One of them is volcanoes, which are so hot that the carbon dioxide that's trapped in the rocks and minerals can be released up into the atmosphere. So that's one way. And we think that that's how a lot of the early carbon got into the atmosphere before there were plants and animals, was through lots of volcanic activity. But the other thing that can happen to it, which is especially useful to us, is it can get trapped, it can get compressed, and the carbon and oxygen can get rearranged to form petroleum products, to form things like coal, to form oil, and I don't have a picture of it, but to form natural gas. And these guys, of course, are fossil fuels. And the fossil fuels are just rearranged carbon from millions of years ago, from plant material. Mostly it's from like aquatic plants. And they're not really plants, but like algae and plankton and stuff like that. And we can take this coal because it's got lots of energy. And we want to use that energy to do various things. We want to use it to produce power. We want to use it to produce energy of motion, kinetic energy in our cars. And we can accomplish both of those things by burning these fossil fuels. So when we burn the fossil fuels, we do a combustion reaction, which is very, very similar to cellular respiration, where we take the carbon that's trapped in the fossil fuels, we add oxygen, and we produce carbon dioxide and water. And so that carbon dioxide and water, the carbon dioxide especially, is going to go up into the atmosphere, and it's going to contribute to the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide that we have, right? That's this arrow up here. And that's very, very useful for us. But it's also problematic because what's happened over time is we've burned more and more of these fossil fuels, and that's caused the atmospheric amount, the concentration of atmospheric CO2 to rise, because there aren't enough plants doing photosynthesis to take all of that extra CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? All of this carbon, it did come from plants a long time ago, but it's been trapped underground really, really stably, and it hasn't been allowed to be released back into the atmosphere. So it's like you take this huge span, millions of years worth of algae and plankton and stuff, and you're releasing the carbon that was in their bodies all at once. And you're releasing it really rapidly. And when you do that, then that's what causes our global carbon dioxide levels to rise. So the gray line here shows our carbon dioxide concentrations, which for the past 800,000 years haven't risen above 300 parts per million, right? 300 parts per million is right here on this top graph. So they haven't risen above that over the last 800,000 years, but they did rise above that in the early 1900s. And as the carbon dioxide levels have risen, now they're over 400 parts per million. And as they've risen, what the carbon dioxide does is it can trap energy from the sun. Sunlight comes in towards the Earth, hits the Earth, it tries to escape as infrared back up into space, and the carbon dioxide traps that infrared and keeps it from leaving. And so as a result, global temperatures have been rising too. And the bar graph here shows global temperatures here, which are also rising because of this carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are trapping more of that heat in the atmosphere. So that's one of the major technological problems or environmental problems that's resulted from this technology, is that our global temperatures have been rising. And that's something that we need to figure out what to do about.